Hello and welcome. Thanks so much for staying to us right here at Press TV as we continue with rolling coverage of the latest reactions, I would say, from Muslims throughout the world. Of course, what we're talking about is that blasphemous film, Muslims that consider it to be blasphemous. It's an American film that has come out depicting Prophet Muhammad in a very negative light. And of course, Muslims feel that this has been a sacrilegious act and something that has been done on purpose. And we have seen strong reactions by Muslims throughout the world, both in the Islamic world and in non-Muslim countries. We have seen different countries like even the United Kingdom and Australia, where Muslims have reacted strongly. And in Australia, we saw that there were some clashes and arrests. In other parts of the Muslim world, of course, especially yesterday, before and after Friday prayers, and continuing today, that we have seen lots of protests. Now, the latest news that we have gotten concentrated on Yemen, as there has been, it seems that there was more protests there, and also response from American soldiers there. We're going to switch over actually to Sana'a and find out exactly what's going on and what's the latest on the ground in Yemen. We'll switch over to Yusuf Mauri standing by in Sana'a. Yusuf, can you tell us exactly, we just had breaking news just a few minutes ago about basically that there has been some arrests, I believe. If you could just fill us on what's going on the ground there. Thank you so much, Yusuf.
Yes, well, a day after 150 U.S. Marines arrived to protect the U.S. Embassy here in the capital, Sana'a, the next morning a youth demonstration launched at about 9 o'clock a.m. When the protesters got there, they started chanting anti-U.S. slogans, and the security forces started attacking them, and they arrested 4 of youth protesters. Now, most of the protesters who were arrested, they were holding flags, black and white flags, which read, "There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger." And inside sources tell me that there is at least 50 youth protesters who have been arrested ever since the protest in front of the embassy started.
Okay, so so are the protests continuing? Are they growing? Just tell me about the overall situation right now.
Well, yes, the protests are definitely continuing here in Yemen, and there seems to be more anti-U.S. sentiment seems to be growing, and more of these youth protesters, they're starting to raise Islamic slogans against the U.S., and they're calling for an Islamic state. They're saying that it's the only solution which will bring an end to the U.S. ties in the Middle East, and specifically here in Yemen. The youth protesters are also holding the Yemeni government accountable for all the youth protesters who have been arrested and who have been injured and who have been killed, arguing that they have the right to protest against the U.S. for the insult against Prophet Muhammad, and any government or anyone who condemns such protests could be an ally of the U.S. and not representative of the people here in Yemen.
Well, Yusuf, what has been their reaction overall when the people found out that there were American Marines now in their country?
Well, the people, they're actually outraged at this because the protest started condemning the U.S. Israeli movie, which is Prophet Muhammad. And from the first day they took to the streets to the U.S. Embassy to protest, they called for an anti-U.S. side. They called on the U.S. ambassador to leave the country. They called on all U.S. diplomats to leave the country. And they also called on all the allies of the U.S. to leave Yemen now, and that they want no part of them. And this is what the protests have been about, in addition to condemning the movie insulting the Prophet Muhammad. And it turns out that 150 U.S. Marine soldiers arrived to the U.S. Embassy, which has outraged the Yemeni people even more, and which is more likely to spark more demonstrations as the anti-U.S. sentiments continue to grow across the country.
All right, well, let me switch over to New York, joined by anti-war activist Mr. Don DeBar. Thank you so much for being with us.
Hello.
What's your take, Don, on that now, after all this has happened now? American Marines, we see, have gone to Yemen. We have now 2 warships off of Libya. Do you think that there's something else going on besides the story that we're looking at on the surface?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, what's on the surface is exactly the issue. You have to look at this in the context of the U.S. policy of information management. And there's 2 legs to this. The first is the idea of demonizing the Muslim world so that war can be conducted as needed against people in the Muslim world. And the process of doing that requires dehumanization of Muslims in the eyes of the American people, Western people in general, who are not otherwise inclined to go to war while they're facing financial catastrophe, among other things. And so the process of dehumanizing them is to present them as religious fanatics. We can bomb Libya for 9.5 months, devastate the country, kill enough people so that almost every person in Libya knows someone that died in this war, and they are not moved, Libyans, to rebel against the United States by that, but rather by a 14-minute trailer in English of a movie that most people in Libya did not have access to because the internet infrastructure was destroyed by the United States bombing. So the people there are fanatics, religious fanatics, rather than people who are justly rebelling against an unjust condition. You can look at the same in Yemen, where there's been daily drone strikes practically. You can look at the same in Iran, where the threat of war has hung over Iran since 1979, and prior to that, you had the 26-year period of a U.S.-opposed Shah. There's righteous anger in all of these places that's been festering for many years, and this is nothing but a catalyst, if that. That's the first thing. The second thing is that this is coming from the West, and its timing, its release, and everything are controlled by the West. Trust me on that. And so there is a reason that this is being brought out that is part of a larger policy that will be coordinated and become apparent as time goes by. That's, I think, a very important consideration for the entire project here.
Okay, well, let me switch over to London and welcome our next guest, the chairman of the World Islamic League, Sayyid Mohammed Mousavi. Thank you so much for being... Okay, I guess we have lost him. Hopefully, we'll be able to rejoin him very soon. Yusuf, are you still with me?
Yes, I'm still here.
All right. Now, Yusuf, in general, as our guest has just said, Don DeBar has mentioned in New York, it seems that, of course, in Yemen, there have been many different acts by the United States or those who support the United States there that many would say, be against the people of Yemen. However, when the people have been attacked by, there have been drone attacks in Yemen, or, for example, many would say a propped up election, basically, when you have one candidate running for presidency, and so many other issues that have taken place. But we did not see very strong reaction or condemnation. As Don DeBar has said, it's curious for him that this time around it's seeing such a strong reaction. Can you explain that? Is it the difference between one political acts and religious acts, and then seeing that, of course, Prophet Muhammad is totally off limit? Or how would you explain it?
Well, the people of Yemen, they've been outraged over the U.S. foreign policy here for many years. As you know, throughout the transitional period here in Yemen, there's been an increase in U.S. drone attacks, which have mainly killed innocent people throughout the country. These places, these rural areas where the U.S. drone attacks are hitting are mainly tribal areas, meaning that when the U.S. drone attacks takes place over there, the whole tribe of that area would call the whole village, the whole province, into protest against the government, which is allowing the U.S. drone attacks to continue. Now, as you mentioned, through the peace initiative, Abdul Mansur Hadi was found to be the Yemeni president. And this peace initiative was, of course, backed by the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, which indicates to the Yemeni people that the U.S. and Saudi Arabia approve of Abdurrahman Masood Hadi leading the political affairs here in Yemen. Now, what this means to the Yemeni people is that this new government will secure Western interests, and the biggest proof for that is the continuous U.S. drone attacks which continue to fly over the country. Now, when this drone came out, the Yemeni people all came out to protest against the mocking of Prophet Muhammad. All political parties of Yemen in general. Now, it was some of the Yemenis were outraged when the security forces started arresting these youth protesters who were raising slogans against the U.S. and condemning the U.S. embassy, the U.S. ambassador, and all U.S. officials. So the Yemeni people right now are becoming angered with the Yemeni government for arresting these youth protesters who are taken to the streets to condemn this U.S. military aggression and to condemn the U.S. film which mocked Prophet Muhammad.
Okay, well, Yusuf, in general, do you think that this, what are experts, are political analysts saying, if anything, so far, regarding how this could possibly backfire on the government of Mansur Hadi? As you've just mentioned, he was supported by the United States. Is there likelihood of that? Are you hearing slogans not only against the United States as you listen to the protesters, but also directed towards the Yemeni government itself?
Yes, well, this is what's taking. This is exactly, and you raise a good point by adding this, because not many news channels have talked about this, and that is the youth protesters who came out to bring an end to this U.S. and Saudi intervention in their internal affairs. Now, anytime you have a government who allows other countries to lead away in the political affairs of the country, and namely the U.S. drone attacks, the people are going to be outraged at this.
Okay,
now,
Yusuf, stay with me. Stay with me. I'm going to get back to you on that. Stay with me, please. I want to switch over to London. We have our guest, chairman of the World Islamic League Occupation, Said Mohammed Musavi. Thank you so much for being with us. Said Musavi, there's some from the Western world that cannot understand the level of outrage coming from Muslims. Can you possibly explain it a little bit more in your perspective?
In fact, the concept of the respect to the religion is completely different in the Western world and in the Muslim world. I mean, the meaning of religion in the Western life is very faint, while the meaning of religion in the Muslim world is very clear and very deep in the heart of the millions of Muslims. That's why the Americans are shocked and they are unable to understand why this whole outrage about just a film, just because they don't realize the importance of religion in the hearts of millions of Muslims. In fact, Muslims are ready even to give lives for the sake of their religion. So that is why the Americans and the Westerners are unable to understand why all this outrage in the Muslim world against this film.
Well, Said Musavi, while I still have you on the line, because our guest in New York, Don DeBar, he had brought up a few different points and said that that we did not see such a reaction. For example, every day we witness various incidents such as the drone attacks in Yemen, or, of course, in Afghanistan, and so many other places in the Muslim world by the United States, and yet we don't see this type of outrage. Can you explain the difference as far as the daily or regular type of political, if you want to say, invasions or going across the line, and now that we're dealing with religious sanctities and the way that we have seen this reaction?
Okay, in fact, the ongoing injustice and oppression practiced by America against the people of the world, and especially the Muslims of the world, is something which is building up since decades. I mean, it is not only in Palestine, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in many countries, but that is something which is going on and building up the convenience. I mean, the people are convinced that America is acting against the interest of the people. But when it reaches to the Prophet himself, when it reaches to the most sacred human being and the most sacred value, which is Islam, then there's no limit for the outrage and no limit for the anger which goes from the hearts of the people. So the outgoing thing is building some bad impression about the oppressors. When it comes to the religion, no one can tolerate any attack or any insult to the Prophet or to any Islamic value.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Said Mousavi. Switching over to New York, back to Don DeBar now. Don, on the one hand, we see many in the West questioning why this is such a big deal and why the Muslims are reacting. On the other hand, we see in several, for example, European countries that questioning certain aspects, let's say in dealing with the Holocaust or things like this, just bringing up a question about it is against the law, even questioning it. What is the difference here in your perspective?
Well, you have the question basically of the sacred, whatever it is that people hold sacred, and there are different things across the world. But it's a similar concept, and it operates in similar ways. There's something very telling about this, for example, in Europe right now, where the Catholic Church has been tax exempt as, policy since the 4th century, where suddenly the crisis of capitalism has people in Spain, Italy, both cradles of Roman Catholicism, now looking at taxing heavily the Catholic Church in order to make up the financial deficit that they face. And you're not getting a huge response from Catholics out of that, despite the fact that this is almost 2,000 years of tradition that is being, materially gutted, and that's on the table. In terms of illustrating the point, though, it's very important to make sure that a one-dimensional image of Muslims as being religious fanatics is not what's conveyed, and that is the intent here. And this film may even have been produced in order to provoke exactly that in the media. And the reason for doing that, obviously, would be to enable, wider war and exploitation. If you look at the situation in Egypt, for example, you've had in the last couple of weeks, and the people, thankfully, have been in the street in Egypt since January of last year, maintaining guidance over their revolution. You've had the elected president, after everything that's happened, on the one hand, making rapprochement with Israel, which is not where the center of political gravity is in Egypt, and certainly not in the revolution, and particularly over Gaza, and then making alliance with the United States over policy towards Syria, which again is not where the Egyptian people lie. Those two things alone would provoke a response like we've seen multiple times in the streets in Egypt, and yet instead the face of that is outrage over this movie that's being portrayed to the world, and the other underlying issues are not presented at all. Rather, it's used to explain the fact that people are in the street. And so we have to consider that dimension to this, regardless of what people actually hold as sacred. And, I don't believe anyone in the world, anywhere, holds their sacred concepts any higher or much higher than they do the lives of their children. And children have been murdered by drones. Even an American 16-year-old, as a matter of fact. Children have been murdered by the policy that existed in Egypt through Mubarak. Children have been murdered in Iraq, Afghanistan. They are threatened in Iran. They're being murdered as we speak in Syria. And I believe that that matters as much to the people there as their religion does, just like everyone else in the world.
Well, point that you've just brought up, do you think that these demonstrations can actually go on and beyond what we're seeing in actually those governments that are being supported by the U.S. For example, as I've just talked to our correspondent in Sana'a, Yusuf, about the government in Yemen, and you've just brought up and talked about the Morsi government that has taken a line that is counter to the requests of the people. How likely are we to see in the middle of these demonstrations backfiring actually on these type of governments themselves?
I think that that's exactly the point. The Egyptian people have been a model in terms of their revolution because they've stayed in the street and they've protected it at each phase where it was diverted. You had the military that was first the friend of the people and then suddenly in opposition to the elected parliament and then in opposition to the powers of the elected president. Then you had the president who failed to reinstate the parliament, by the way, which is something that the United States wanted to see. And then you've seen these policy shifts. And in each case, up to this point, the Egyptian people have forced a correction of that policy. And I think you're seeing that in Yemen, and I think you're seeing that in Libya, by the way, also. And I think you're going to start seeing that. You're starting to see that in Saudi Arabia, which is the most interesting part of all of this to me.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate it. Don DeBar, anti-war activist in New York, and of course our own correspondent Yusuf Mauri and Sana'a, and Sayed Mohammed Musavi came from us from London, chairman of the World Islamic League. We appreciate all of you being with us, and thank you, viewers.